On this episode of the Photography News podcast, cameras from our 20s, Kingsley's surprisingly good idea, and the benefits of legacy lenses. Hello and welcome to the latest Photography News podcast. My name is Roger Payne and I'm the editorial director at Photography News. And in light of the fact that this is our 29th episode, I thought that I'd introduce my two colleagues and ask them to tell me a camera that they bought in their 20s, which may be harder for some of them than others. So let's start with contributing editor, Mr. Kingsley Singleton. Hi, Kingsley.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm very good. Lovely to see you. It's been a few weeks, but absence makes the heart grow fonder.
That was my stock polite intro message. Hi, how are you doing?
Excellent. So, you are the contributing editor of Photography News. We're about to, as a podcast, leave our 20s. So, give us the name of a camera you bought in your 20s.
Well, there are three cameras. I think the first one that I got in my 20s, well, I didn't actually buy it. It was a gift from my then soon-to-be wife, and it was a Minolta XG9, which I'm waving in front of the camera now. And that was my first. That was an upgrade from my Zenith SLR. So it was a nicer thing, and it had sort of some whizzy features like the fact that it didn't have rust on it and stuff like that. But perhaps more sort of surprising was I bought in my 20s. I bought a Kodak Advantix camera, which I'm not entirely sure this is the actual number, but I seem to remember it was something like a C450. And it was an APS-C film camera, which was like, I'm tempted to say complete rubbish, but actually I have sort of reasonably fond memories of that format, like particularly because of the slightly sort of cheated panoramic thing you could get out of APS-C film. And of course, like as lots of people will know, APS-C format film went on to be the basis for, lots of digital cameras in terms of
Yes, and I feel that I should correct you at this point and actually say that it wasn't called APS-C then, it was called APS. That was all it was.
Sorry,
it was called APS. I do recall being on the launch of APS in Paris. It was, as I recall. Will, you may have been there as well. But it was Kodak actually took us to Paris. I'm not quite sure why, but it was very nice of them to do that. And APS. And I remember there being a discussion amongst the journalists on the bus about the fact that really this was just a precursor to digital, because it was a kind of like a bridge, if you like, between technologically it was a bridge between film and digital at the time. But anyway, so we'll let you off having an Advantix, I think.
Because of it's obviously I knew at that point it was going to be highly influential, but also it did have those advantages, didn't it? Like the thing where you could basically wind the film back in and change films and stuff when it was not actually completed. So that all seemed quite cool, and it sort of accepting the fact that it was obviously like a smaller sort of exposable area, and therefore the quality wasn't sort of as good. And then because my 20s covered 1994 to 2004, I worked out. So what also fits into that was an original Canon PowerShot. I think it was a G3 or a G5. Right. Canon ended up kind of reintroducing all those numbers about 10 or 12 years later, I think. But this was like the original brick shaped one, which was about 5 megapixels, I think. And I bought that sort of just before DSLR started to get, quite affordable. Maybe it was like a year and a half beforehand. And so I would kind of jealously stare at those things. And it was damn expensive, because it was kind of I probably paid sort of 600-700 quid for the thing, including I believe it was a micro drive sort of compact flash shaped thing. Can't remember the capacity. It was
some megabytes. Some megabytes.
Yeah.
Well, so on the basis of the fact that do you only now own the Minolta then? Have the other two gone the way of all other sort of digital bridge cameras?
I would imagine so. Actually the Canon one I managed to sell on eBay for about 40 quid. I think. I couldn't believe it. That was about 6 months ago, and someone wanted it for something. I don't know what.
Well, if you're that person who's listening to the podcast, then get in touch. You were amazed, or Kingsley was amazed that you managed to buy it off him. So Minolta XG9, I think we'll take, just purely for the romantic reasons. But so, well, there's three there. So Will, editor of PN, Mr. Will Chung. Hi, Will. That's the longest time it's taken to introduce somebody on this podcast before. How are you?
I think I've had a cup of tea in all that time Kingsley took up answering that question. If Kingsley's going to give three cameras, then so am I.
Oh,
so my three from the past: Nikon FE2.
Yes.
Which was my first Nikon. I changed system. I can't remember why, but I bought that with a 20mm 3.5 and 100mm lens as well, 105mm lens rather. So that was one of my very first Nikon. But also bought, I don't know why I bought this around the same time, going mid-system, but I bought an Olympus OM2N as well. And I think it's just purely because I loved it, and the Olympus were really good on their advertising, as you probably recall. They had people like Bailey and Litchfield and Swanell advertising the brand, and I thought, I can't lose Olympus completely, so I did buy the Olympus as well. And the third camera I bought, which has got less good memories, I bought my Mamiya M645 1000S because I wanted to go medium format, and like you do, you buy something which is hot at the time. So this was a 645 format camera, so only about 2.7 times bigger than the 35mm. And I thought that'd be a good step up to get better quality. But I used it for about 3 or 4 months, and I noticed that I was getting tiny, tiny dots, tiny black specks on the negatives. And I couldn't work out why. And I remember testing, putting the film through it, testing it, and eventually ringing up Amir and saying, look, this is rubbish, take it back off. So I got rid of it. I swapped it for an RB, a Mamiya RB67, and went properly medium format. So I had three cameras in my 20s, Rog, and those are the notable three. My 20s is obviously some way earlier than Kingsley's. And also, interestingly enough, you mentioned the Avantix and the digital precursor element, but you probably remember that camera, which is an Avantix Preview, that you could take a shot on the film and it would give you one digital preview.
Ah, right, okay.
And then that was it, because then, of course, once you previewed it, I mean, there's nothing you could do about it because it was a picture on film. But once you previewed it, that was it. You couldn't store it. Then you took another picture, and then you got another preview.
Right.
I do remember going to the launch of that, and I wasn't alone in the room thinking, why have Kodak done this? What are they doing? What's the point? And clearly, there was no point.
No, indeed. Well, I mean, I know it's probably, I suppose I feel that I should add my cameras from my 20s, but I haven't got three because I spent most of my 20s actually being a technical editor across various photographic magazines. So I had no real need to buy a camera because I just had pretty much all of them coming in. But one camera that I did buy in my early 20s was a camera which I still maintain as one of my favorite cameras ever, which is a Canon T90, which I do still own. And I bought that. That was... I'm in between Kingsley and yourself, Will, in terms of when my 20s actually were. So my 20s ran from 1988 to 1998. The T90 actually came out in 86. But I was a little bit of a late adopter and bought myself a T90. Still got it, doesn't work, but still love that camera.
What a shame.
Anyway, that rather lengthy introduction might mean that the next bit is a little shorter. We'll keep it slightly more to the point. And that is we normally start a podcast off by discussing what we've been photographing ourselves. So, Kingsley, do you want to kick off? Have you been to 3 different places and done 3 different things? Or what have you been up to photography-wise over the last couple of weeks?
Well, probably the most notable thing that I ended up doing was I went to the Yorkshire Dales to do a bit of landscaping for a few nights, and I had not actually stopped in the Yorkshire Dales before. I've been up to that sort of part of the country, but I've not kind of explored it. I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was a really nice mix of kind of chocolate boxy sort of barns and stone walls and things, but then when you get up on the tops, then it's very bleak, and so you can be a little bit more sort of bleak. Really.
I'm assuming that the bleaker areas were the ones that attracted you. the most? You're not much of a chocolate box landscape photographer, are you? Let's be honest.
Well, I think thanks very much. I think that the chocolate boxy stuff was kind of dependent on the light, which we didn't have much good light really when I was there. So the kind of the bleaker ones ended up being a bit more kind of like to do with like longer lens shots, funnily enough, of sort of bleak rolling hills and kind of little patches of sunlight and kind of stuff like that, and sort of distant details and things like that. But yeah, I mean I'm definitely going to go back there. Oh, and I also went to Asgarth or Agarth Falls once, but that was the middle of the day, and I tried some long exposures, but I didn't. You know when you go on one of these things and you kind of feel like, well, actually things aren't really hanging together. You take a load of pictures and you sort of, but you know in yourself that kind of. I've not had a really good look at them yet, but I'm not sure there's much success there. One of the things that I did manage to achieve while I was there, though, was not breaking my leg, because as anyone who's been down to that waterfall knows, there are these, I think, is it sandstone that's been kind of worn away in places, and there are these kind of amazing holes in the sandstone, basically, which are about, I don't know, some of them are about 20 centimeters wide, but probably about 3 feet deep, and like real ankle breaking kind of stuff. So yeah, I didn't kill myself, which is
no injuries at all to report.
No injuries at all. I mean, there was like an incredibly harsh shower of rain at one point during that day, and actually we had walked there while also dodging a thunderstorm, thunder and lightning, trying to kind of stay out of that way, but got rained on a lot and ended up although I did have a waterproof cover for my bag, I didn't have anything for the camera, so I took my jacket off and just chucked that over the tripod with the camera on top.
Excellent.
Well, Kingsley, well done on not breaking yourself, and you didn't break any camera kit either then, which is very impressive.
No, I can't. I mean, perhaps I should investigate it more thoroughly to see if I did.
Perhaps you should try harder.
Yeah.
So talking of camera kit, Will, that's been your mainstay of the last couple of weeks, has it not? You've been busy testing.
Yeah, it's been a busy time with kit, and we'll talk about that when we get to the next issue. But the camera I've been using a bit of is a Nikon ZFC, which I'm sure many readers would have read about in the previous issue, which is it's basically a camera based. Well, the camera looks like the old Nikon FM2. It's a 20 megapixel APS-C format dig. So I've been playing with that, which has been rather fun. Yeah, but it's been mostly testing. I have gotten into insects more. This is obviously the influence of my partner Annie, but I don't do any old flies and ants and all these sort of small tiny things she does. I do pretty things like dragonflies and damselflies and butterflies. And Kingsley mentioning the fact he got caught out in the storm. I literally walked to our nature reserve from where I live, and it's 5 minutes walk. And it's beautiful and sunny when I left, lovely and warm. So I didn't take anything like waterproofs or anything like that. I went and photographed some butterflies, but there were plenty of them around at that time. And literally, I got so drenched because it suddenly appeared. This rainstorm suddenly blew in. I got completely drenched. Luckily, the gear survived it, but luckily, my Nikon Z7 is waterproofed, or weather resistant, shall we say. So the camera survived. But honestly, with the weather at the moment, because I don't know what it's been like for you guys, but it's been so cloudy here. No sun at all.
It's been the same for me, and my photographic endeavours have been fairly limited over the last couple of weeks, largely because I've been moving house. And so, as regular listeners to the podcast might know, a lot of my photography actually comes when I'm out walking the dog. So I've been discovering the local area, and I've happened across rather a nice little woodland full of sort of old oak trees and silver birches and stuff like that. And although the weather's been quite cloudy and overcast, there's definitely loads of potential there. So once we get a bit of early morning sunshine, I think there's going to be sort of spider webs and, light coming through trees and all this sort of stuff. So I might do a little sort of mini project around a local wood near me, obviously with my XE4 and single lens, which I'm sure you'll no doubt be horrified by, the pair of you. But no, so it's been a fairly dry couple of weeks for me. Let's move on then, Will, in terms of like just talking a little bit about what's in the upcoming issue. You've hinted there that there's going to be a lot of kit tested, which is obviously good news. I'm interested to see what you've got to say about the ZFC. It looks quite a nice little camera. But of course, we've also got a big show coming up, haven't we? So I presume that'll be reflected in the issue that you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, you're talking about the photography show and the video show, which happens at the NEC, Rog, of course. The show didn't happen last year. I mean, it normally happens in March. And of course, that was the beginning of the pandemic last year. And then they moved it to 2020 September. And of course, that got cancelled. And now the show is happening on the 18th and 21st of September. So we're recording this late August. And, I'm sure listeners will pick this up early doors in September. And if they haven't heard of the show, then have a look. It's well worth considering going. And if you're going to book tickets, I mean, looking at the way they're working at the moment with the government guidelines, you have to go along on the website and nominate a time when you're going to turn up. So you need to think about that before you start booking. But yeah, it's a lovely show, Roger. I intend going. Photography news is kind of half there, if that makes any sense. Photography news is still being given away in the food hall area, but we will not have a stand this year. And that's purely, of course, in consideration of what's going on at the moment. But the issue itself, Roger, yes, we have a big TPS special. So that's going to highlight what our readers can go and see at the show. I mean, there's potentially some big new cameras. There are all sorts of rumors circulating at the moment. There could be cameras from Canon, Fujifilm and Nikon. And of course, there's some stuff that's out there already, which maybe a lot of people haven't seen. You could include, for instance, in there the Sony A1, which seems to be putting up trees everywhere in terms of what it's achieving. So there's lots of stuff to go at. So we've got a special there about the show. Then I mentioned the Nikon ZFC. That's a nice big review. I enjoyed doing that. And some other stuff. I mean, I'm just reaching out, picking this thing up. This arrived yesterday. This is an Edenchron 1, which is a battery-powered flash. 131 joules, was 133 joules. Not overpowerful, but powerful enough.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, as you see, it's only the size of an f2 7-200 zoom. It's quite amazing. So we've got a whole load of test stuff in there. It includes that anyway. And I said the aforementioned Nikon. So, Roger, it'll be a good issue.
It will be a good issue. And if you're not going to the show, if you don't pick up a copy at the show, you can, of course, read it on our website. The URL for that is photographynews.co.uk. You can also get in touch with us. If you have a question for us, we'll answer some questions a little bit later on in the podcast. You can get in touch with us on podcast@photographynews.co.uk. And you can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. And the handle for those is @PhotoNewsPN. So we kicked a few ideas around in terms of what we thought we'd talk about in the main body of this podcast, and we ended up going with Kingsley's idea, which is quite unusual, really. And he said, well, why don't we do something about coastal landscape photography? And at the end of the day, the majority of our listeners are in the UK, and obviously that is an island, and so there's plenty of coast to go at. You should be no more than, I think, 2 hours away from a coast, depending on where you are in the country. So, I mean, there's an obvious appeal. But Kingsley, seeing as this was your idea, maybe you can kick us off, set the ball rolling, and tell us why people, if they haven't been to the coast with their camera, why they should.
Well, I think that's a lot of pressure you've put me on. I've had the idea. Now I'm worn out. What are you talking about? Well, it's like I think that in terms of landscape photography, water is a big factor often, isn't it? And, there's a lot of water at the coast, as you might have noticed. And there's a lot of ways to shoot it. One of the reasons I thought of it was that I kind of was sort of delving through an old folder of pictures, and I actually found some long exposures that you, I, and one of our colleagues had done back in about 2014, when we'd gone to Hunstanton to do a challenge on using long exposure filters. And I had taken a piece of welder's glass and made these kind of like what I ended up thinking when I saw them again were sort of reasonably nice long exposures. I'm going to stick them on Instagram so people can decide for themselves. But I mean, I think that's one of the things that kind of gets people into the coast to start with. It's the kind of the photographic aspects of shooting water. But then as you spend more time at the coast, you realise that there's kind of more complexity. There's more to shoot. I mean, what do you guys like to shoot at the coast?
Will?
Well, water again is the obvious thing, but of course an awful lot of interesting buildings. I mean, I'm a big fan and always have been of beach huts, because they're kind of colourful and very, very British. And I used to love going to places like Southwold and Clacton and Walton, seaside towns around East Anglia, basically, which is where I used to live. I used to love that sort of as a subject. It's basically because it's colour and nice shapes. You get people interacting with it as well. So yeah, water's a good thing. And of course, you look inland, and of course, there's plenty of good landscape very close to the coast too. And just one thing about water while we're talking about the sea, just a word of warning, which can't be overstressed, but it is very dangerous out there. So if you do go to the coast, just take care. Don't try to get cut off by the tide or pulled in by the undertow, because photographers can take a risk. And indeed, in PN in 2019, we did an obit on a lady who died actually during a photographic workshop at the coast. So just a word of warning to listeners, just take care when you're out there. The only thing I would say this time of year is you have to get there early or stay out late, purely because the light in between is not so good. And also, of course, this time of year, these places are very, very busy more often than not. So for me, it's a place, oddly enough, in the summertime, I try to avoid purely because of the busyness. And Rog mentioned it before in the podcast, I've got a project on piers. And that project I've still got to finish. And now that we're out of COVID, almost out of COVID at least, I intend to finish it this year. But I'm not going to start looking at that until October, when there are just fewer people around. But Rog, what about you? What do you do at the coast when you go?
Well, the last time I went to the coast with a camera, I ruined it. So, because I was trying to do some pictures down sort of low near the edge of the water as it was kind of wafting in, and I was trying to do some sort of alternative angles and wasn't really paying attention to what was happening out in the sea. And sure enough, it was engulfed by a wave, as was I, and the poor thing expired. And it made some quite interesting sort of fizzing and popping noises and got very hot as it expired. But it's never been alive since. So yeah. So as well as looking after yourself, obviously, which is quite right, Will. Do look after your camera gear. And I'm sure that we'll come on to probably just talk briefly about the best things to do to look after gear. Will, you're about to jump in there.
Well, I'm sorry, I was about to jump in, Rog, because you're talking about gear and failure and all the rest of it. And I know we're going to come on to gear, but this happens to be on my desk, and I'm going to show it to you guys and explain it to the listeners. This is a Leo photo. It's a Leo photo Poseidon. And this is a tripod designed for such occasions, that it's got titanium legs that are sealed so that sand and grit and seawater can't get in. I just thought I'd mention it. So I know we're going to get to gear in a minute, but
we will.
It caught my eye. It was just sitting there glinting away. It's a beautiful carbon fiber tripod. And we will be testing this in Photography News as well in the future issue.
Excellent. And it's blue as well, just in case you were unsure, just in case calling it Poseidon wasn't enough. They've made it blue also, just to kind of really drive home the watery point, which is very helpful. So let's jump back to actually coastal photography itself, Kingsley. And in terms of like location, so I've fairly flippantly said everybody's only 2 hours from a coast, but of course that coast might be particularly uneventful from a photographic perspective, or are we saying that anywhere is an option to go and shoot? It's just a question of getting to the coast.
I think anywhere's an option. I mean, I think we all look for different things, and we can all look for different things, sort of via different trips. Like last weekend, I drove out to North Lincolnshire to do some pictures, and I ended up on what's it called?
Mablethorpe. Was it Mablethorpe? That's well known up there.
It was up that corner. Yeah, like north, like it's sort of heading to Louth and then kind of going sort of northeast. But what you basically do is you end up in these kind of, this is sort of conflicting with what Will was saying about the place being busy. It was absolutely deserted. It was miles and miles and miles of completely deserted sands. I mean, the reason it was deserted was because there wasn't an arcade there or an ice cream van or a McDonald's or something, I guess, which was perfect for me. But there was lots of kind of, interesting stuff like, bits of kind of rotten wood sticking out of the sand, you know, sort of shipwrecks, groins, kind of interesting pebbles, things like that. You know, so you can do stuff there. I guess, you know, what a lot of people kind of end up looking for is kind of classical compositions where they might have like kind of a rocky foreground with water moving through it, leading kind of into sort of a subject in the distance. And like that is one of the things that I think is can be kind of challenging in coastal photography, is that what you can end up with if you don't compose with a fair amount of concentration is kind of quite a lot of nothing. And like in a sort of in a long exposure picture, in a sort of minimalist kind of way, that's absolutely perfect. But if you're wanting to shoot a kind of a fairly regular traditional landscape, what you've got to contend with is that like a large proportion of the image may, certainly if you're using like a longer exposure, have sort of nothing in it or be very blank. So you're looking for kind of balance and things like that to try and sort of offset that problem. And also, you know, if you're sort of walking along a headland or something, like the coast literally only sort of has one side, doesn't it? So you may end up having a picture that's kind of quite unbalanced with a lot of stuff on one side and kind of not the other. So, you know, it does take some careful consideration, I think.
Quite a lot of nothing sounds like a book title for my photography. So I might have to steal that one. But okay, so what we're saying is anywhere is viable, because even if there's not like a castle on the headland or a series of cliffs or stuff like that, then you can maybe look at a more macro level, photograph pebbles, photograph shapes. Kingsley, go on.
Well, I mean, I think that's the thing. So you saying castle on a hill, immediately you think of those shots of Dunstambra. I think it's Dunstambra Castle, isn't it? You know, with the kind of with the kind of the round rocks in the foreground. You know, but I think like part of the joy of like landscape photography is kind of going out and discovering something for yourself. So like obviously you can go to those places and you can get those shots, but you know, a good challenge is simply to you know to head to the closest bit of coast to you and basically try and find something that you know that you like there.
Okay, and so go on, Will.
No, I mean it's a good point that Kingsley makes. You can get something from virtually anywhere you go, and also just worth reiterating the fact that you don't always need brilliant sunlight. You can get lovely moody skies that can work really well. And I did a project when I turned up on the beach randomly at one point, and the light was quite flat, but I got my extreme ND filter out in the tripod and made all my exposures at 2 minutes, and my project became known as 2 minutes f11, because everything was taken in that exposure, and there was a sea coming in and out, bit of sand blowing around, but the sky was dull as ditch water, but still worked out. So don't be put off if the weather isn't that great when you turn up. Just trying to make most of it. So not just in terms of what's there on the beach itself in front of you, in rock pools, whatever, but also what's happening above you. Always worth stressing.
Yeah, and you can get some pretty incredible cloud formations, can't you, out over the sea? I distinctly remember going to a location in Norfolk, like Hokum. I don't know if you guys know Hokum in Norfolk. Where there's these incredible sandy areas, and I remember taking some pictures there, where the cloud formations were just absolutely incredible. And yeah, so there's definitely plenty to go at. I mean, I was going to ask the pair of you. So like, if I had a sort of a place I was going to make a beeline for from a coastal perspective, I'd definitely head into Norfolk, just because there is such a range there. So you've got places like Wells, where you've got the beach huts that Will you've mentioned. You've got that further along at places like Cromer, but then you have got the sort of vast expanse places like Hokum and other places around there. Plus the fact you've got very sandy areas, and then you've got very pebbly beaches. So there's plenty to go at in North Norfolk. So you guys can't have North Norfolk. But Will, if you were going to jump in the car and drive to a coastal location in the UK, where would you be setting the sat nav for?
That's a good question. I would probably head towards Dorset and the Jurassic coast, all along there. It's wonderful down there. And I was just thinking of, as you were talking about Norfolk, I was thinking about West Bay, which is a bit further along on the west side of the Jurassic coast, and the cliffs there are amazing, and there's plenty to walk around. And of course there are other places like Dildo Dawes down there, Kimmeridge. So I don't know the area that well, and that's why I would head towards it. I know Norfolk and Suffolk and Essex much better. So I'd like to go somewhere like Dorset. I think that's where my sat nav would take me. What about you?
Yeah, I was going to say Dorset's taken, Kingsley, Norfolk's taken. Where are you going to the Lincolnshire bleakness?
I mean, it's no. I mean, when you asked that, sort of two spots, kind of inconveniently at different ends of the country, and both about 4 hours away from me, came to mind. I thought of particularly like the South Devon coast. I like, particularly in the winter, because the sun sets sort of into the horizon in a lot of those areas, and you can use that as a focal point, which is great. So you can have like rocky foreground, burning sun in the distance, sort of thing. And there's a particular spot called Aimer Cove, which reminded me that something else that's kind of worth talking about is how the landscape at the coast changes with the tide. At high tide, Aimer Cove isn't particularly interesting, but at certain times of the year, and certain kind of tide times, it reveals all of these kind of lines that run out into the sea, and at certain times of the year you can match that up with where the sun's going down, and it sort of looks brilliant. I mean, and in terms of Northumberland, I know like Will's actually not long returned from the frozen wastes of the north, but like that is an amazing coastline, like, to shoot. It's craggy, there's loads of castles. You head somewhere like Holy Island, if you go and stay on Holy Island, you can shoot all day, because of the kind of the movement of the sun. You can move around the coast. There's loads of kind of brilliant things to shoot there.
And in terms of, I mean, we've touched on it already, but I'm keen to revisit this particular subject, maybe because I've got a slightly sort of different view on it. And that is that the whole thing about photographing, doing long exposures at the coast, everybody does it now, don't they? I mean, it's like sort of whack on a 10-stop ND, and everybody goes for the slow. Oh, look out! Look at the milky water and the movements in the clouds. Bit overdone now, is it, or do we think there's still space for it?
I reckon there's space for everything, but like, I know what you mean, because in some ways, like, it's not enough to just get a long exposure. And what in a lot of ways, what you ought to be doing is matching your exposure speed to the intention of the picture, because like, you can go and shoot something at 30 seconds or a minute, and the water's going to be very sort of static. Really, it's just going to turn it into a mist. But if you work around like half a second, third of a second, 1 second, then you get a lot more flow in the water, and that can be your kind of lead in. So like, no, I mean, I agree. Like, I know it's rare for me to say this, Raj, but I totally agree. Like that, it's kind of, yeah, it's very much kind of about like intention. And yeah, you can have like a long exposure that sort of means nothing, can't you?
Yeah, go on, Will, defend the long exposure.
Well, I'm just going to agree with Kingsley, which I know is unusual too. I still enjoy long exposures. I just do my own thing. And the only thing I would say is, because many of our listeners, and certainly many of our readers, are Camera Club members, and if they produce a long exposure in their club competition nowadays, the judge will go 5 out of 10, or give it. They basically give it a low score. So I think a lot of club members might have been put off by that, but I think just do your own thing. And if your intention is to depict movement in the sea and the clouds and all the rest of it with a slow shutter speed, then fine. But if you're down there on a stormy day, you go to Newhaven, saying you want some waves breaking across the breakwater there, you use 1,000th of a second, depending what your intention is. So I would just say do your own thing. And yes, we see an awful lot of long exposures, and yeah, to be fair, you can get tired of them, but you can interpret it in your own way to give yourself pictures to be proud of.
I was going to say whether or not it is about something about how conveying what you find when you get there, because if it is a kind of mill pond smooth kind of day, then freezing using a fast shutter speed to freeze the action is not really going to make any difference. Whereas if you use a long shutter speed at that point, then it does give you the opportunity to add some interest. Whereas obviously, if you've got a more stormy, more waves going on kind of day, then a faster exposure, shorter exposure even, is the way to sort of help harness that power. I don't know, just very quickly. Sorry, go on, Kingsley.
Well, I was going to say about the kind of, what you said there, like, yeah, the texture of the sea, and how how like particularly at dawn and dusk, the way that the light plays on the texture of the sea is something that you can control with shutter speed, because too fast you can end up with kind of quite a jumble. Too slow, you might lose it entirely. But kind of picking something, whether it like it could be anything, but like half a second to a second can sometimes just smooth things out enough to make them kind of pleasant and sort of calming, but retain some of that kind of texture.
So, I mean, let's move on to just talk a little bit about kit. We're assuming, obviously, that most of our listeners are going to turn up at the coast with a few hundred quids, if not a few thousand quids worth of kit. So, looking after it is particularly important. Now, assuming we don't all have a Poseidon tripod, well, Kingsley, what are your thoughts about what kit do you take along with you to keep your kit protected when you're at the coast? And yourself, for that matter.
Well, I mean, like welly, I've probably said this before, but wellies are definitely the photographer's friend. Like, when you're kind of, because like, I mean, actually, like having wet feet has never put me off taking pictures, and you quite often just forget about your extremities when you're in the moment, don't you? But like, sort of protecting yourself, dressing kind of for the conditions is kind of really important. And obviously, like, the weather can be more extreme near the sea. It can be windier and colder, and but like in terms of protecting the camera, I would generally take stuff like I usually keep a shower cap that I nick from hotels in my camera bag, and you quickly kind of bung that on the camera, if you can see like a big kind of breaker coming. But also because, like you were saying, if you're setting up fairly close to where the waves are, you're going to get like a little bit of spray, and even a little bit of spray can be kind of problematic, particularly if you are using filters, or you haven't kind of got your front element kind of out the way of it. But so adding things like making sure that you bring your kind of lens cleaning stuff, maybe a microfiber towel, just in case you need to sort of mop up a bit of water, is quite a good idea.
So what about you, Will? I'm sure there are some added bits and bobs that go in the back of the Chungmobile at the point at which you head off to the coast, knowing that you are Mr. Gadget Man when it comes to taking things to look after your kit. So what else do you take?
Oh, I take a bunch of stuff, and I'm a little less mean than Kingsley. And one thing I suggest to listeners is to get themselves go to an outdoor shop and pick up a stuff bag as well as a microfiber towel. And the stuff bag, all I do is I put it on top of the camera. And when I shoot, I just whip it off, take some pictures, and then put it back on if the thing's on the tripod. And that's purely because it's not just the sea spray, the obvious sea spray, but also when you're out at the coast, it's just very fine spray, which you don't really notice. And unless you wear, I know if you wear spectacles, you probably do. But often there's a lot of spray around, so to keep salt off. But filters is certainly something. I mean, we talked about long exposure filters, but I'll certainly take along a polarizer, which of course can take some light out of your picture as well. But also, it can just make more of the sky. I mean, just be wary of it. Don't use it on your ultra wide angles, because you get some patchiness within the sky because the sky is unevenly polarized. But if using, say, on full frame at 24mm or 28mm, a polarizing just bring out the colors a bit more. And if you're doing things like, as I tend to do, pictures of beach huts, polarizing can cut the glare out from the colors, so you get much more saturation. And also, I mean, take a backpack, of course, and again, just make sure if the weather's going to turn, that you've got the weatherproof cover in there just in case it gets really bad. But in terms of lens choice, I take everything from wide angle to moderate telephoto. So I'll probably take 3 lenses typically,
right,
and a bunch of filters and a tripod.
Because the other thing to be careful of is changing lenses when you're, that close to the water or spray. Because like Will was saying, and even if you don't notice any spray, you are in these kind of these kind of salty conditions where there's salt blowing around and stuff. So like it's not, I mean, it really isn't the camera's friend, like the coast, which is why so many lens factories are built not on beaches, they're built inland.
Yeah. And one other thing I was just going to mention about kit is sort of tripod care, because like I say, we haven't all got the sort of tripods specifically designed for use at the coast. And so inevitably you are going to get grit and nastiness going into the tripod legs. So I think it's worth saying that it's definitely not the case to just like leave it there, is it? So when you get back from the coast, are you Will running your tripod legs under the tap or taking them apart? What do you do in terms of looking after your tripod?
Roger, when I get back, first thing I do is to take them apart and rinse them under fresh running water.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a couple of tripods with twist grips, and I've gotten used to pulling the legs out, and I know how to put the thing back together again, which is the main thing. But with twist grips, they're easier to take apart. I mean, lever locks are a little more difficult, in my experience at least, to take them apart to get rid of all the sand. But yeah, I take a twist grips around, wash them under cold running water, and just leave them on the draining board for a few hours, and then put it back together again. Yeah, but after every trip to the coast, that is certainly one of my missions. And interestingly enough, that's the thing about that Poseidon, which it's not a cheap tripod, but it's not hugely expensive either. But to avoid that chore would be quite welcome. So I'm going to take that to the beach and do exactly what we just talked about, which is get the thing covered in sand and seawater and see how it fares.
What about you, Kingsley? Any additional tripod tips to add there, or are you just running it underwater as well?
I think it's the same sort of approach insofar as you definitely don't want to be turning up to any kind of shoot with a tripod that is kind of badly maintained, because particularly with those twist locks and lever locks, all it takes really is a little bit of grit and sand and stuff to get in them. Suddenly they sort of lose their, either they won't open or they won't close. And when it's very frustrating if suddenly you're sort of pirouetting around to use a different leg or something to get the angle that you want. So yeah, look after your tripod. That's what I say.
Indeed. Well, perfect way to end that particular bit. That's some really useful stuff there. Obviously, if you do head off to the coast based on our advice, please do take care, but do also send us some images. We'd love to see them. You can send them through to the email address, which is podcast@photographynews.co.uk. It is time to answer some reader questions. We've got a couple this time round, and I'm going to come to you, Will, on this first one. It comes from a chap called Alan Ames, who's from Norfolk. Great part of the world, Alan. Good for coastal photography. Get to the coast, man. And he says, I like to shoot wildlife, and having just upgraded my Canon EOS 70D to a 7D Mark II, with the improved specs, I thought I would give the auto ISO mode a try. What do the team think of it as a feature? Are there times when I shouldn't use it, and how should I get the best out of it? It's quite a lot to cover off there, Will, but auto ISO, fan or not a fan?
Well, Roger, it's an interesting feature. I've developed a taste for it, so I'm quite keen nowadays. Generally speaking, I have to say, if I'm walking the streets shooting candids and stuff, I tend to set the ISO according to the light. I'm kind of a Luddite in that respect. So if I walk around and think, oh, it's sunny, I'll set 400. And if I go around the corner and it's very shady, I'll get the camera up and go, I'll set 1600, say. So I like to take a very hands-on approach often. However, I've been doing more and more wildlife recently, and this is where I found the useful aspect of the auto ISO. So, for example, when Annie and I went to the Dales, and we were photographing on the moors, and it was around sunset. So it was quite bright when we got there, and the sun gradually dropped down below the horizon. And that's where I used auto ISO. I set the range I wanted. So my minimum, I think, was 400, and my maximum was 3200. And that's one thing you need to think about, setting the maximum, because when you buy a camera and the default setting is basically the whole range. And generally speaking, the top 2 speeds or 3 speeds of a camera generally aren't that great. So you could decide what your limit is. So you may do a test or two. So when I was doing these wildlife pictures on the Dales, I set, like I said, a limit of 3200. And then the other thing I set was shutter speed. So basically when this feature would kick in. And that's the important thing to consider. So if you're using, as I was, and looks like Alan is as well, using a long telephoto lens where, of course, you're much more risk at camera shake, even with the latest image stabilizers around, and including the in-body ones. You need to be careful with that. So I set a shutter speed, and let's say you could set 500th of a second, for instance. So when the feature will kick in and when it won't go below a certain shutter speed. But certainly the two things that are important: the top ISO and the shutter speed you use. But Alan, well worth trying. Give it a go. Just set a limit on it so you don't end up with pictures that are very, very noisy at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And just to throw my two penneth in before we go to Kingsley, I use it all the time. And it is about, I think you're absolutely right, Will. It is about understanding what the the sort of the limits are in your ISO on your camera. I would have thought on a 7D Mark II you could probably comfortably get away with 1600, 3200. Kingsley, I'm imagining, I don't know why, but you probably don't use auto ISO, or am I wrong?
No, well, actually, it's something that I've started using more since I got my Z7 II. And there's no massive reason for that, because I think the ISO performance is probably pretty similar to the D850 DSLR that I had. But it seems to go hand in hand with kind of using sort of more modern kit. I mean, like ISO is one of those things, isn't it? That like I think like we're also, from the early days of digital cameras, we're all probably a bit scarred by like the thought of high ISOs and the fact that you couldn't go over 400 without it looking like you'd taken pictures in a gravel factory or something. But like ultimately, if you're resistant to that thing, it's a bit mad in a way, because it's a bit like the difference between being able to change film speed. Like if you went back 50 years and you said to someone, well, this film can miraculously change its sensitivity to give you the shutter speed you want, like they'd bite your hand off, wouldn't they? So like I don't really see that there are no downsides to it. And as you guys have sort of already said, like the real thing is just working out what's your maximum that you're kind of willing to put up with. And like that's easy to do. You just take a load of test pictures and you kind of decide, like how much kind of digital noise you're kind of willing to put up with. And I guess it also comes down to that old idea of like it's better to have a sharp picture that's slightly noisy than it is one that's kind of blurred. I mean, because we've all taken like spur of the moment pictures and like, oh god, they're all kind of motion blurred and stuff because you were in the wrong light.
Yeah.
So it's really it's the way to get away from that, isn't it?
Absolutely. And so a big thumbs up from the team, I think, Alan, to auto ISO. Have a dabble. Go on, Kingsley. Something to add?
One other thing, I think Alan said, are there times when you shouldn't use it? And I guess in a way that returns to our conversation about long exposures earlier. And it's like kind of, I mean, really, it becomes a very deliberate choice to set your ISO kind of, or not to use an automatic, but to set a manual ISO. And that could be because you want the fastest or the slowest, shutter speed. But yeah, majoritively, it's like, if it's kind of moving between kind of 100 and 1600, you ought to be able to get, sort of great pictures with good quality, no matter what sort of light you're shooting in.
Bearing in mind that Alan is using using his camera majoritively for wildlife photography, I think it's probably a definite thumbs up on that. Will, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, just following what Kingsley was saying, and I know Alan's a nature photographer potentially, but I'm just thinking listeners out there might be thinking, oh, next time I'm in the studio, I'll use auto ISO. And I thought maybe that's when you don't use it either in the studio, if you're using flash, for instance, because of course you'll be using a set shutter speed. And the auto ISO may be trying to think, oh, I'm going to ramp it up to 3200 because it's quite dark in here, and you set F11. So that's another instance, but not Alan's question, but as an aside for other listeners.
Good point. Okay, so let's move on to the second question, which comes from Jim Herbert, who's in Herefordshire. And Jim asks, for years I owned a Sigma 18-200 with lots of numbers and letters after it, macro OS HSM, and took lots of nice close-up photos. But someone at the club told me it's not a real macro lens. Are they wrong? And if not, do I need a new lens? So, Kingsley, Jim has been happily taking macro photos, and now he's been told that he hasn't got a macro lens. Does he need to switch, or are other people at the club right in the first instance?
They are right, yeah, because that's not what you would call a true macro lens, insofar as a macro lens should give you a one-to-one reproduction of the subject on the sensor. I mean, and I guess what happens is that kind of lens manufacturers use the word as a sort of a proxy for close up, because it looks better, it sounds better. That lens, I believe, has something like a 1:3 reproduction ratio, so like it's still pretty close. And I think that's the kind of the thing. It's almost like a lot of these kind of conversations go on in clubs and in other places where people try and sort of split hairs over these things. But like if Jim was happy with the pictures he's getting, then crack on. That's what's the most important. If you want to get closer, you find that you can't focus close enough, then you're going to have to invest in a dedicated kind of macro lens. But like there are loads of lenses that focus reasonably close and give you kind of decent close-ups, like the Nikon Z24-70 f4 that I've got. That focuses really close, and you get like a kind of a 1:4 reproduction, so you can take reasonably close up images without sort of achieving this kind of technical or scientific definition.
If I can just request on the technicality, are we saying that macro lenses are only those that reproduce 1:1? Because I'm pretty sure that there are some macro lenses out there, or there are badged as macro lenses that record 1:2.
Will?
Will?
Well, I suppose, excuse me, it depends how pedantic you want to be, but I think in the olden days, as if you were to look at it like that, people used to say, life-size magnification, i.e. 1:1, did qualify to be a macro lens, and that has been stretched. And there are well-known macro lenses at the moment around 1:2, and indeed there are some which are ultra macro, which is the other way, which is 2 times life size. But we can get a bit pedantic about it, and it's marketing speak, Rog. I mean, live and let live, I say. But the only thing I would say to Jim is, if you want more magnification, you can add things to your lens to get even more. There might be close-up lenses or an extension tube, for instance. But also, I'm going to be slightly controversial here and just say to Jim, look, that lens is quite old it's been around a bit, let's face it, and it wasn't that great a lens when it was new. So, I want to be controversial and say, look, consider buying a new macro lens and do it properly and get yourself some better quality pictures as well. Hey, there you go, controversial.
There we go. Well, there you go, Jim. So you don't own a macro lens, but so from Kingsley's perspective, if you're getting good pictures, you're getting the sort of pictures you're happy with, then carry on. From Will's perspective, buy a new lens.
Chuck it all in the bin.
I suppose I don't know whether there's a Mrs. Herbert who might have a say in that. Okay, good. Well, those are a couple of questions beautifully answered by the chaps here. So if you have a question for us, then do just get in touch. It's podcast@photographynews.co.uk. We noticed that looking at our listening figures that we have listeners all over the world. So we'd love to hear, particularly from our overseas listeners. Particularly, don't expect us to come up with coastal locations in, for example, Namibia, because I think somebody does listen in Namibia. Has Namibia even got a coast? I'm really show my.
It's a good question, Rog. It's a good question.
It's very well known for its coast, Rog.
Anyway. You're listening in Namibia. Let us know the best coastal locations. We'll tweet them out. Okay, wonderful. So let's wrap this 29th episode up by ending, as we always do, with a Will's word of wisdom. Interesting one this time round. Will, go ahead.
Well, it was a listener or rather it was a contributor who got me thinking about this. She's talking about using her legacy lenses, her old lenses basically, which she used to use for film on her digital camera, because she thought her modern lenses were too sharp. And I've been thinking about it too, because that got me thinking that maybe I should buy the odd mount and adapter. So my word of wisdom this month is basically to encourage our listeners to, if you've gone mirrorless, and assuming that's an important consideration, but consider using their legacy lenses. I'm sure many of our listeners and readers have got the odd lens. They might have sold a lot of their kit, but they still might have the odd lens kicking around. And, we started this podcast by talking about cameras we bought when we were 20s. And the Olympus I mentioned, I bought that with a 50mm 1.4 lens. And I thought that would actually make a good legacy lens to use on my Nikon Z. So I bought an adapter, just used the well-known online retailer. It arrived, and it's great. I've got a 50mm 1.4 lens, manual focus on my Nikon Z. And it doesn't give incredibly sharp pictures, but it gives a nice sort of character, some nice bokeh background. So I think it's an area worth exploring. So basically, if you've gone mirrorless, consider going back in time and using the odd lens you might have in the cupboard, or just you might have picked the odd cheap lens up on eBay as well. And let's get some pictures which aren't as sharp as normal.
This sounds like heaven to Kingsley, like sort of not very sharp, slightly out of focus images. It's like this right up your street, is it not?
Yeah, well, yeah, like going back to my predilection for heavily green tinted welder's glass for long exposures. Yeah, I think you bang on. I mean, yeah, like a lot of people. I mean, a lot of professional photographers use like older lenses because, like, on medium format bodies, and sometimes they'll take older medium format lenses and put them onto new digital backs, because they say that it has this kind of esoteric smoothness or softness, or and the complexity of lens design means that there are these kind of things that kind of crop up, in the sort of different looks. One 50mm f1.4 doesn't look the same as another, because if its construction is different, it's going to kind of manipulate and channel the light in different ways. So yeah, all power to the lens converter.
Indeed, and it's almost like delving into the world of cinematography a little bit, where I think a lot of DOPs will actually choose the lenses to deliver a certain look and feel to something.
Yeah, there was a spate some years ago of people buying old projector lenses, anamorphic projector lenses, and fitting them on cameras, which creates this kind of squished image, and then you open it out and you get this kind of like, actually sort of quite a sort of a soft, creamy effect to the image, but it's this much kind of wider format. It's kind of interesting stuff to play with.
Absolutely. Indeed. Good stuff. Well, that's a grand word of wisdom to finish on, Will. So thank you very much for that. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much to contributing editor Mr. Kingsley Singleton. Thank you, Kingsley.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. That once again is my stock response for.
It's a pleasure to have you. And that is also my stock response, which may only be partly true. And also, thank you to editor of Photography News, Mr. Will Chung. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, guys. And thanks to all the listeners too.
Indeed. Thanks very much for listening. We hope that you'll tune back in when we turn over 30. We'll speak to you then. Cheers.